Hello, I'm Jim McKenzie. I'm sitting in today for Tab Townsend, Metroplan's Executive Director. Welcome to the Better Community Lecture Series. This is a local panel discussion based on the first lecture in that series. Today's panel is going to discuss the local reaction to and potential for the impact of the first lecture that we had from Joe Minicozzi. Joe is a nationally known urban planner and a lecturer in great demand. And in August, he spoke to over 100 citizens of Central Arkansas, business people, government officials, professional planners, and just citizens. Mr. Minicozzi is principal in the planning and development firm Urban 3 in Asheville, North Carolina. Joe's lecture emphasized that since all cities or corporations, the business side of the organization should pay some attention to the productivity of its assets. In this case, the tax productivity of different development patterns, some of which contribute to the corporate bottom line and some of which continue costing the corporate bottom line over time. So if you're interested in seeing Joe's presentation for yourself, you can find it on the Metroplan website, metroplan.org, or at the link that'll be shown on your screen later. You can find his PowerPoint presentation at that location as well. Joining me today on the panel are Mayor Mark Stoddle of the City of Little Rock, and we want to thank Little Rock for hosting us here today, and LRTV for filming this discussion. Mayor Mike Watson of the City of Maumelle, Gabe Holstrom, the Executive Director of the Downtown Little Rock Partnership, and Ward Davis with High Street Real Estate and Development in Springdale, formerly with Hendricks Village in Conway. So we want to thank you all for being here and participating. You all attended the initial lecture and heard Joe talk about an understanding the market forces of regional development and the dollars and cents of development patterns. So let's just start in turn, starting with you, Ward. Give us what your key takeaway for Gabe's presentation was.
My key takeaway from the presentation from Mr. Minicozzi, and I think in terms of income statements and balance sheets, and so when I look at his information, my key takeaway on the income side is where value is concentrated and where it's not. So value very much concentrated in downtown. He used a slide number 10, where he was looking at Lafayette, Louisiana, and value was concentrated in downtown, and the second largest spike was in a traditional neighborhood development that was outside of downtown. And then on the other side, where value is not concentrated, and that's in big box stores. And on the expense side, what jumped out at me was on slides 11 and 12, and that's just the massive growth in the United States in infrastructure per capita. Slide number 11 shows that the number of, for instance, fire hydrants per 1,000 people has increased 2,000 times from, I guess, 2.4 to, whatever 2,000 times that is.
Ward, hold on a second. Let's see if we can get slide number 11 up, Casey. One more. There we go. There you go.
2.4 per 1,000 people to 51.3 in 2015, and linear feet of pipe per person has increased from 5 feet to 50 feet. And also on slide 12, the miles of roadway in Little Rock has increased from 367 miles in 1950 to 2015 we had 1,232. So the massive increase in infrastructure per capita on the expense side.
Okay, Gabe.
Well, I think it's a fascinating way to present data that Mr. Minicozzi has been able to take and then present to people that are interested in development in cities and downtowns. And the slide, I'm not sure which one. Maybe it's slide number 5, where you compared the big box store with the 6-story, the 5-story building that's over 100 years old, and then to a residential house. I think it's the slide right before this one. That's pretty amazing when you look at that, because I don't think at first glance, especially people that don't look at these numbers every day, if you ask somebody, well, would you rather have I guess a layperson, would you rather have a Walmart or another big box store, or would you rather have, 120-year-old building? They're gonna oftentimes suggest the new big box store. So showing the dollar value and the tax value of what that produces, and again, that's in a different way. That is a balance sheet for the government. The municipalities, as the mayors both know, they rely on these on tax dollars to produce and provide the services they do. So fascinating to just have that out there for you to look at what that really means in dollars.
Thanks. Mayor Watson?
Well, as Gabe and Ward have both said, it was eye-opening to me. I'd never thought of taking the taxes and dividing it out on the size of the project to get a per acre on it, like Mr. Minicozzi demonstrated. We buy and sell land based on an acre price, but I'd never sat down and looked at it. So he made me go back to my office, and I actually looked at comparable numbers within our city, and it was very clear that we have some of the same. Now, our differences weren't near as great as some of the ones he'd pointed out, but it was very clear that a large development that covered more than 10 acres was not returning as much as the half-acre and the 1-acre developments, and partially because of the just the standalone buildings on a half-acre site was still a cost in the improvement side of it. He mentioned the land cost, but then you had the improvement cost on top of that. And so that was interesting to me, go back and just look at it in our community. And what he also pointed out was that there was in the presentation, he talked about that tax assessors say, well, they get a break if they have a large tract of land. And so a large area that had 200 acres, they got a break on their taxes, where everybody across the road in smaller parcels had higher tax rates. And that 200 acre has a lot more road frontage on it that we're responsible for maintaining. So that's kind of made me look at things a little differently as far as that goes. But changed my way of thinking on how we look at taxes, and especially property taxes. And Maumell's slightly different than other cities. We don't have a downtown with the high-rise buildings, but we do have older buildings that could be redeveloped. And so that was what we've got to look at in some of our rules and ordinances.
Great. Mayor Stola, Little Rock's more of a classic case. What are your thoughts?
Well, thank you, Jim. Well, certainly I think the graph that shows the growth of the city of Little Rock from 20 square miles to 122 square miles tells the story of growth. And I guess the question really is, how do you define growth? And you've got to put it in an urban and in a suburban context. And so while 122 square miles is the urban area of Little Rock, it's still, from a standpoint of Mr. Minicozzi's premise, it's still, I think you could argue, those western reaches are more suburban in nature. There's no question that the formula that he suggests, and that is that the more dense the property and the more commercial the development, the higher the value of revenue you're going to get off of taxes. The challenge, of course, is that there are in defining the productivity of your assets and how you spend your revenues to maintain public services is really a balance question. One could argue that the growth of Little Rock is based purely on annexation. It doesn't take into account the issues of integration and desegregation, actually, that we're celebrating this weekend, and the growth of the city westward, partially fueled by those issues, partially fueled by schools, partially fueled by just the situational narrative of developers and where they choose to develop, and they balance that relative to those other constraints: distance, congestion, and urban density. So those are some of the realities that we as mayors and cities have to deal with. There's no question that if we could concentrate everything in that urban area, much like a New York City, where you have boundaries and to the point where you don't have to worry about whether or not you got parking downtown. Nobody uses parking. They use all sorts of transit to get by, and you don't have to worry about whether you have parking spaces or not. Even in downtown Little Rock, the issue still is how close can I park to where I work in the most dense part of the state, which is the downtown part of the city of Little Rock. And so I appreciate the analysis. I think it certainly tells the story of maximizing value and minimizing the kind of expense that we cities have for streets, sewers, drainage, gutters, and all of those kinds of things. But I think there's got to be a real factor put into it in terms of how you balance that. So what is it? Does it mean you put in various restraints on annexation? Does it mean you put in various incentives for redevelopment downtown that are not otherwise available for people who choose to build beyond certain boundaries? I think those are some of the interesting questions that we as municipal officials and land use planners should look at in terms of whether those kinds of things would help us maximize the return on investment that we as a city make.
Right. There's one word that you used several times, which was balance. And Ward, you used it too in terms of a balance sheet. So you have both the revenues generated by a particular type of development on a parcel, and you've got the cost to serve on the other side of the ledger. And how those, go to the island and the sea slide, there you go. How those balance out citywide determines whether you're in the red or in the black from a tax revenue standpoint for the services that you've got to provide long-term. There's one other interesting slide, slide number 13, Casey, if we can, that's a variation on the Little Rock slide that shows the population density, and the 1950 boundaries of the city of Little Rock has lost 60% of its population since 1960. But it is still less dense per square mile than the remainder of the city of Little Rock that's grown since the 1950 boundaries, which is interesting. The city, of course, is still responsible for maintaining all of the infrastructure in the 1950 boundaries with 60% fewer taxpayers in there. So it certainly puts the public sector in a dilemma. We want to welcome to the panel one other member, Mr. Jimmy Moses, who is with Moses Tucker Real Estate, is in the development business and has been a developer in downtown Little Rock for some time. And Jimmy, you got here just in the nick of time.
Great.
Because I was about to ask the next question to you and Gabe. From a standpoint of downtown development and redevelopment, what should we be doing to maximize what Mr. Minicozzi says is some of the most tax productive land in our metropolitan areas?
Well, I think the easiest thing for me to talk about immediately is continue to work on improving what we have now with the historic rehabilitation tax credit. This past legislative session, the legislature increased those incentives a little bit, and so where the overall benefit will go from at the high end $125,000 to $400,000, but still that pales in comparison to every single state that surrounds us. So if you really increase that incentive, that's going to really be an attracting factor for some of these older, especially larger buildings that we still have in some of our downtowns across Little Rock and across the state. So that's going to be the easy answer, and I think that's what I'd like to see continue to be improved at the state level.
Jimmy, how about you?
Well, I would say that when you look at a downtown like Little Rock, you've got this wealth of built infrastructure investment. It is what makes a city unique, its urban core, and so we need to embellish it. We need to take it to the next level. And how do we do that? Well, it's complex. It's not easy, but it starts, I think, with the public sector stating that it's important that our urban core be as vibrant as we can possibly make it, and then developing a systematic methodology from the top of City Hall down to assure that quality development is done and expedited and that we form perhaps a one-stop shopping method of getting your building permit and all the related activities, zoning, entitlement, all handled perhaps by one person in City Hall. That's one thing that's relatively low cost, could be accomplished, and sends a message to the world out there that Little Rock is solicitous of downtown development. The other thing that I really believe is that we're missing here in Little Rock is we don't have a development strategy in place. It's been many, many years since we've done that. We had a downtown development plan, and it actually seeded the river market, and not many people know that. But I think putting a plan in place that's thoughtful, that involves professionals and locals, both public and private sector, would give us some direction for, say, the next 5 to 10 years about where investment should occur, both publicly and privately, and set the stage for the private sector to put money into the urban core.
I might add to that in a couple of ways. First of all, on the issue that Gabe mentioned, there's an educational level that our developers need that many do not have or desire to take advantage of because of the ease of development in other parts of the city. Jimmy is one of the few that understands not only the challenges but also the opportunities that development downtown creates. So the ability to take advantage of historic tax credits, both state and federal, the ability to leverage money through the EPA on brownfield loans, zero interest brownfield loans, some ADFA type lending and loan structures that can benefit the rent structures that ultimately play out in these buildings are issues that in other states and in other urban areas there's a much higher sophistication, in my opinion, with the development community. And I think that's important, and certainly I'm a big proponent of the preservation aspect of our buildings. We've lost some, unfortunately, because we have a lack of sensitivity by some folks who own property. We've been able to save many of those properties now, and I think people are understanding the benefit of that. We still have 2 or 3 major structures right on the core of Main Street that are prime for redevelopment, and we've got people talking about it, and hopefully they'll take advantage and learn the levers that can be used to try and get those areas developed. As to the master plan, I can't agree more with the comment that Jimmy Moses made. We had money in our budget for this year to contract professionally for a master plan downtown. I'm hopeful to have some of that money available this year and to get it fully funded for next year so that in 2018, before the end of 2018, we do have a new master plan development for downtown. So just want to make sure everybody knew that's certainly something that's been on my radar screen to try and get done. We know that we've got some areas east of Main Street and south of the River Market that are certainly underdeveloped in terms of density, and it would play directly into the concepts of Joe Minicozzi's formula. That would be very beneficial. And the desire that we see now with millennials and others that want to live in a more urban environment, I think plays hand in glove with an opportunity that's there. But we've got to have the financial triggers that are available, and we've got to have the developers that are willing to do it. And I'll certainly compliment Moses Tucker as being one of those developers that's taken advantage of that and continue to let us know the things that as a city we can do to try and improve. One of the things that is high on his list, that's also obviously high on my list, is burying the overhead utility lines that we've got, which we think are obviously not only ugly, but they cause extra problems in terms of short electrical outages and things of that nature, and it causes a frustration factor that's a needless extra expense that our developers would prefer not to have. And I think that means you've got to try and have a good working relationship with your private utilities, which we continue to try and address. For example, I just had a meeting with the Public Service Commission to talk about the usage of LED lighting downtown and in other parts of the city. And it's a struggle to try and get people to understand the importance of that and figure out a financial way to get that done. But again, it's what's happening in a very direct way to help cities be progressive.
Well, let me take what the mayor said and ask Warden Jimmy to respond, not necessarily strictly as developers that are sympathetic to this kind of development, but for the broader development community, if you will. What does the private sector need in order to see the benefits to this more productive type of land development?
You know, I appreciate programs like historic tax credit programs and that sort of thing, but to me, the real key to encouraging development downtown and in in urban areas is actually to knock down the barriers, the regulatory barriers that stand in the way. And there's kind of two. I say regulatory, there are actually two sources of barriers. One is the tax code makes it very hard to aggregate land because it's very easy to park a piece of land in an unproductive state. For instance, since we tax a piece of property based on value, if somebody has a parking lot downtown that's, even if it stays empty, they don't, it's a good way for them to set that piece aside, especially if a downtown is increasing in value. It is the lowest cost of entry way to be able to participate in the appreciation of a downtown. Unfortunately, that parking lot also holds hostage all the infrastructure that's around it. So that burden is borne by the rest of us, and only one person or that entity is the only entity that benefits. So it's just a function of our tax code that makes it very easy to hold property hostage when it could be elevated. The second piece is generally our zoning codes and technical design standards in most places in the country, but in Arkansas in particular, are aimed at suburban areas. I'll take zoning codes first. With Euclidean zoning, it's use-based zoning. People talk about RMF 4 for 4 units an acre or 12, but it's residential segmented against commercial segment, and that happened for very good reasons in the past, but it makes it very difficult to do mixed-use development. Even when cities encourage me to develop in their municipalities, I've got a different regulatory process to do mixed-use development than I would if I was going to do single-use stuff out in the suburbs. But even and cities are around the state are doing a great job of addressing that. They have a PUD process that allows you to do mixed use. They have some cities have form-based overlay districts that allow allow zoning based on form, not on use. That helps a lot. But then the next layer kicks in, and that's the technical design standards. So a lot of times cities will require that have large front setbacks for front yards and that sort of thing for residential homes, won't allow utilities to be put under streets or in alleys. Those technical design standards are perfectly comfortable in a suburban environment, but they're not comfortable at all if you're trying to do tight urban development that's really focused on walkability and really antagonistic to walkability. So our technical design standards and our zoning standards are just, the table is tilted against us. I actually get more uncomfortable talking about incentives because it makes people think like downtowns have got to be subsidized. This math that Joe has done has shown us that the downtowns are the most productive areas. If we just level the playing field and for developers, then we can develop actually the most productive stuff, not the least productive stuff in the city.
Jimmy, what's your thought?
Well, I actually think the city I'm by far the most familiar working in, Little Rock, is done a great job from a zoning standpoint to encourage mixed-use development in the center of our core, which is all largely a urban use or UU zone. There are no parking requirements, for instance. Mixed use is encouraged. Public transit is built into giving additional density and upgrades to a developer. So we have done a lot of good thinking and implementing some really good ideas in Little Rock, and I applaud our city for doing that. But we as a city and we as a state don't really get it yet. We're getting there. That urban development is so much more effective and efficient from a cost standpoint and the utilization of our best resources in the state. And so we have no real incentive program whatsoever. Tax increment financing doesn't work very well. It's very limited in its ability for several reasons here. That's been in use around the country for 30 years. It's almost not in use at all in the state of Arkansas. If you build a new building in Memphis, downtown, there are tax abatements, and they stage them, but they range from a few years out to 20 years. Tax abatement would encourage tremendous additional development in the urban core. And there's all sorts of arguments about whether that's good or bad, but rest assured the cities that you see around the country that have done great things in their core have got a series of true incentives to work from. And of course, we've had improvement districts, and we've used one in downtown Little Rock. We can't even agree in Little Rock among our business leadership whether they're good or bad. And I personally think they make a lot of sense, and they help underpin the policing and maintenance and upkeep of downtowns, but they require investment. So I think we need to look at the quiver of incentives, both public and private, that we don't have here, and particularly compare ourselves to progressive cities that do have them, and then attempt, and we have to work, I know, at the state level through our legislature and constitutional reform to get some of these changes made, but we need to do that. And a few things could make a big difference, I think.
Okay, so the private sector guys have bounced the ball over the net to the public sector guys. Let me ask the two mayors your perspective. Now, you come from very different type of cities. Little Rock is an older central city with some historic density. Maumelle was designed as a suburban community and is actually developing less dense than it was originally designed. But Mayor Watson, for example, you alluded to going back and doing the math, which is one of the things that Joe recommended for each community. Do the math for your community and see what it tells you. Where do we go from here in terms of taking the information that Joe presented to us and putting it to work? For example, Arkansas is 50th out of 51 jurisdictions, if you can include D.C., in its lack of reliance on the property tax to fund local government, over-reliance perhaps on the sales tax. So what kind of policy changes, what's the next step in taking this information and actually putting it to work here in Central Arkansas?
Well, thank you, Jim. Just one small step that I've already looked at. About the same time we did this seminar, we had a building that was being remodeled in Maumelle. And when we looked at the building permit fees, the building permit was 4.6 times higher for remodeling than it was for a new construction of the same size building. And so my city council is now considering an ordinance to make a remodeling permit not be higher than new construction would have been. So for instance, if you have a 10,000 square foot building that you want to build new, it would cost you $1,900 for your building permit. Just the building, not including mechanical and electrical and plumbing, but the building permit. But if you were going to spend $1 million to remodel an existing 10,000 square foot building, the fee was $10,000. So it was 5 times. So we've realized that we're disincentivizing people to remodel their existing building, tear it down, build a new one for building permit purposes. Now, I understand there's still economics of having the existing building, but we're already looking at that to try to change, because I knew it was a problem. I went to the seminar, then the building permit came in, so then the owner comes and complains, and it's like, okay, we need to do something here. The other thing that, that we've always done in Maumelle, even though we've been planned from day one, and we do have PUDs. We've got PRD and PCD, which allows so much commercial within a residential district and allows for development, but it's not really occurred. We've got one 6-story building that has offices on the first 2 floors and then residents on the next floor going up from there. But their dilemma is always keeping tenants in that building, because that's the other thing, is we gotta have the buyers or the people that wanna live in that type use. So which comes first sometimes? Does the developer build it hoping they'll come or not? But that building, and now it was built in 1988, so it's an older building. It could probably be updated and they could keep vacancies up in those residences. But it's small things that we could do, and one is right now we're limited to 3 stories in a lot of our areas. We need to look at that issue also to say, well, do we need to raise that, especially in a PUD development that could allow for some mixed use so that we could go to the 6 stories. But what we have to do is grant a variance if somebody comes in with a 3 or higher than 3-story or 2. Our code says 2.5. We compute that to 3, but it's 2.5 stories, which I've always tried to figure out where the half story was in that building. But so we need to look at those items too. But I think that's the takeaway, because if we develop denser, the infrastructure is less, the tax base is more, and it helps us. Now, we still have vacant lots within our town center district, is what we call it. Vacant commercial lots that are still developable. We need those to develop too, so we're kind of fighting our own selves to say, let's go back and develop these older buildings, but now we've still got vacant tracts inside. We're not looking to expand out a whole lot beyond our core already, and so it's a balancing act. It really is. And the problem is the property owner controls the price of the land, not the city. And so we've talked about ways to try to create entities that through economic development groups or something to be able to purchase that land to maybe incentivize development at times through that avenue. It's done in industrial land all the time, but I don't think it's been done in commercial districts.
Good. Mayor Stodler?
You know, in reflecting on some of the conversation that's just occurred, I was thinking through a couple of the issues, and sometimes, you put into play regulations, but the mindset of the people who are using them does not always follow through in the same context. And let me explain. We, as Jimmy mentioned, we've got UU zoning, which is very open and flexible. You can do just about anything you want to, no requirement for parking, and yet we've had people who've wanted to move downtown, they want that urban environment and use, and then all of a sudden they figure out they need parking because they still are in the mode of wanting to drive their car, or they live in such a distance that they have to drive a car as opposed to use other transit. And so then they push on the city to bring in more parking. And so there's a real disconnect there to some extent that we've got to work on, and just in terms of that whole cycle of how do we narrow that divergence. And then there's the issue of desirability. I can't remember at the moment what big major business that was in a suburban area, and I don't know if it was in Seattle or Portland, decided they were going to move back downtown. And they were going to bring, and they're going to bring their employees to live or to work downtown, which obviously is going to prompt many of them to want to move back downtown. And so when we've got a building like the Donaghy building that's over 150,000 square feet, or the Boyle building, both of which are now being looked at as residential, probably with some mixed use on the first and second floors probably, I guess you could ask the question, is there some major employer that would move into one of those buildings that would really spur a lot of additional activity? Certainly we want that residential. We know that if we can have that residential downtown, that a lot of the commercial will follow. I know that we're desirous of trying to get a real grocery store downtown, and how we do that, and a lot of it's going to be tied to the addition of residential. I think hopefully before the end of this year or early next year, there's going to be close to 300 apartments right on Main Street itself, with the planned developments that we know of in a couple of the buildings. So what can the city do? We waive fees. If you put residential in one of our buildings in the downtown area, as I recall, we are required to waive 75% of all the building permit fees. Obviously, it's an incentive to try and get developers to bring in residential. So that, and trying to educate some of our landowners. It's interesting, I've made this comment before, that a lot of the people who own property on Main Street really made their money in other ways. And as was mentioned, they are able to hold it and make it into a parking lot and get some sort of a rate of return on it, but they do hold it hostage in terms of the issues of development. We've got probably 2 blocks right on Main Street that are the most desirable blocks for redevelopment in the entire state, and one of them is a very nice parking lot, and the other one is a whole half block of a parking lot. And this is right on the intersection of Markham and Main Street and Clinton Avenue and those junctures there. That is really not the best way to be looking at land use intensity, by making that into a parking lot. And so how do we get people to look beyond that and get a vision for what can be developed is a challenge that we have. It's a parochial challenge, really. These people are people who grew up in Little Rock, and you find that really, frankly, the more sophisticated people that come in to look at redevelopment are people that have done it in other locations, with the exception of my friend Jimmy Moses, who obviously has looked around the country at redevelopment there too. You know, we would love to see that more intense development, because Minicozzi is exactly right. I mean, the tax base that gives us a return on that is going to be much more desirable than seeing a residential subdivision out west, or another open air promenade that is certainly going to be nice, but it's not going to give us the best rate of return from a taxation standpoint.
I can explain the thought process on the parking lot just in 2 seconds. Especially for a person that's made their money in other areas and doesn't need cash flow. If, let's say, a parcel in downtown, if downtown's doing great, thanks in large part to the work Jimmy and Red have done downtown, and everything downtown increases in value, all the buildings increase in value by 5%, and the land is 10% of the value of an overall building. Well, really, when the tide goes up, it's location based. So that 5% value increase is really attributed to the land. Well, that means that the person that just held the land and didn't have to build a building and all that headache, their piece of property just increased about 50% in value. It's actually the incentive is for them just to sit on empty land, because a building is a pain, and their return on total capital invested is actually much less when so they have an incentive to hope that everybody else develops something and that they do not.
That's a real interesting observation. You know, from a public sector standpoint, the city stepped up to the plate with $22 million for a technology park. I prefer to call it an innovation corridor, but it's a tech park. And so we were able to convince that board to locate downtown on basically on vacant land. In the meantime, we were working with other developers to try and develop some of the existing buildings. And they were being relatively successful in not only doing that, but raising the property values extraordinarily high as it relates to those adjacent properties. And so you fast forward about a year and a half, 18 months, and the property then that the city, the taxpayers are going to use to pay for these vacant lots has just increased extraordinarily high. And so from a value standpoint, it cost us a whole lot more money to buy those vacant lots and buildings that were underutilized than it would have had if we were not incentivizing or trying to promote the redevelopment of some of those other buildings. I've always remarked that that was really, people ask me, how did the values on Main Street, what's the value of property? And I said, it escalates daily. And, you better jump in now, because, tomorrow it's going to be at a different rate, and it's likely going to be higher. So that may have subsided a little bit now, but the bottom line is that the redevelopment helps to promote and really incentivize a person who owns property that's undeveloped to wait and see how high it's really going to go.
Folks will do what they make money at. It sounds like the underlying tax structure provides incentives for doing what is antithetical to the greater public interest, and disincentives for doing what benefits the greater public interest. Perhaps that's where we ought to look to change the rules of the game a little bit. We're about out of time, so we have an opportunity for one last comment. Jim, why don't we start with you?
Well, I would say the key to successful urban development starts with enlightenment. Realizing that a vibrant urban core makes an entire metropolitan area more vibrant is almost now a given. We're embarking on trying to bring Amazon to Little Rock, a very worthy idea, by the way, and I applaud the mayor for wanting to lead that effort. Our chances are, we don't qualify very well, but if we can have and engage in an enlightened discussion about what we should do to encourage major employers like Amazon or Bank of the Ozarks, you name it, local or from afar, to come first to our city and then perhaps into our urban core. And what are the things we need to do to set the stage to encourage that to happen? That includes everything from looking at our tax structure, the way we value things, as Ward has said, to public transportation. We had a chance to vote for public transit here a year ago. We turned it down. We got close. And I think ultimately we will. But if we want to do away with surface parking lots, then I'll tell you that we've got to have a great public transit system. You can't just have an average one. And we have an average one trying to become great. So we've got work to do there. And then I'll go back and say one more time, I think it's about a lot of little things that we can do at City Hall right now to facilitate quality development, make it as easy as possible, so that the return of $1 of private sector investment will ripple through the economy in a pretty remarkable way. And that happens best, I think, in the urban core.
Great. Ward?
I think Jimmy makes great points from the development perspective. So I'm gonna take a stab at kind of the Minicozzi and the municipal side. He keeps saying do the math, and I just think of the math that I would like to see is, with our current development pattern, and let's assume zero growth. I mean, we hear over and over, if a city's not growing, then it's dying. But if I said that about my personal finances, if I told you that my personal finances have to go up by 3 to 5% every year, or else I was gonna not be able to feed my family, you would tell me I was being irresponsible. So if we had zero growth, would we be able to finance the infrastructure that we've already got in place? Are we suffering an effect of really chasing after the next sugar rush with, by chasing big bucks? It's very infrastructure intensive and just really not that productive over time. I think Joe has kind of opened me up to thinking about that, but I'd like to see the math really on a specific local level to know more,
Okay. Great. Gabe?
Well, I think another part of this is here we are now in 2017, where with a couple clicks on your phone on Amazon Prime and whatever you want that you may have gone to the big box store previously for is on your doorstep in 2 days. So what does that look like 2 years from now? I think everybody who read the paper today saw that Walmart wants to have a tube to your refrigerator to populate your fridge with food. I don't know that I'm ready for that yet, but they're apparently thinking what's the next biggest thing. What I would like to see, and I think what becomes clear, and one of the things that Jimmy has alluded to and talked about are the lack of the tools, the incentives that we have here as a state. So I think a discussion among the people that are to stand to benefit. So whether it's the municipal leaders, whether it's the developers, whether it's the realtors, to have a discussion and pick an incentive. Whether it is how do we go about tweaking the TIF districts? How do we go about educating the legislators, changing the Constitution? Pick a path, pick one of these, and let's go for that, and let's advocate for that. Is tax abatement what we want to work on? All these are valid that have seen a great deal of success in other communities and cities our size and cities that are bigger across the country. So I think a discussion among the impacted parties and to go after one would be a great step in the right direction.
Great. Thanks. Mayor Watson?
Well, from the city's perspective, what we have to do is we have to provide services to our constituents, our citizens. And the way we do that is through taxes or through fees collected. And Maumell's one of the, well, it's the only community in Arkansas that has what's called a community service fee that we collect $6 a month per house. So, everybody hates that. I will tell you that. All the citizens do. So we're looking at ways to do away with it, with another tax or something like that. But it's one of those things, we've got to think outside the box. And, maybe there's ways to do it, because we've got to have viable police departments and fire departments and low crime rates for our cities to grow. And we also have to maintain all of our infrastructure that's there that, as Mr. Minicozzi pointed out, is given to us, that then we're responsible for in perpetuity. So it's something we have to do. So we've got to look at ways to increase our tax base, either through property taxes or through just the redevelopment of property. Maybe that's it. Or, someone else brought up Amazon and everything else. I'll throw out there the internet sales tax. We've got to do something. Everybody's purchasing. The big boxes are going away. The stores are going away, the brick and mortars. And so what we've always thought about is we want that big box to come to our community. Well, that may not happen anymore. And so we've got to replace that tax dollars that we lose if there's not a brick and mortar there. So, whether it takes federal legislation, state legislation, that's something I think that we need to look at hard. And I know that every purchaser on the internet hates to hear that, but it's viable to the cities that we continue to provide the services that we're having is we need an internet sales tax for purchases from the internet.
Great. Mayor Stodel, the last word.
Well, I guess I would close by saying that the strength of a city, or the healthiness of a city, is really defined by its core, the heart of the city. And I've always considered that the urban downtown is the heart. And if the heart's beating strongly, the rest of the city and the appendages will beat strongly as well. And in that context, we have to understand, as it relates to Mr. Minicozzi's point, that not everybody wants to put their business downtown. Not everybody wants to live downtown. And so from a municipal standpoint, we still have an obligation to serve those citizens, as Mike said. And that's the challenge when you balance the revenue stream that you've got. And so you've got to look at that. I mean, in our state, 85% of our property taxes, which is what we've been talking about, go for our schools. So the city's revenue streams are largely dictated to by sales taxes and franchise fees, and we get a little bit of that property tax, but nowhere near what other cities in other states get. So I can't underscore any higher what Mike said about the internet sales tax. That we are eroding 10 to 13% a year of the tax base on failing to collect the use tax that otherwise would be collected as a sales tax. That has a direct impact on our bottom line. And now we've got Congress talking about other tax reforms. They're talking about eliminating state and local tax deductions for citizens and mortgage deductions for citizens. That is going to put additional pressure on municipal government to try and figure out a way to fund other things. And so when you look at all of those issues, I'm a big fan, if you're going to redevelop the urban core, the preservation tax credits for commercial use property is extraordinarily valuable. 20% federal and 25% state. The higher we can get those limits, that really can help make the numbers work. You do that, and you look at some EPA opportunities to help, and you can make some of these things pencil out. And the bottom line is, for a developer, and we've got two good ones right here, if it doesn't pencil out, it's not going to get built. You've got to figure out a way to pencil it out. So if we can educate our developers to be sophisticated about that with our existing constraints and try to work on some of these areas that will help free up some of the revenue, I think we can accomplish a lot that is ultimately going to help us maximize the ability to get the best amount of revenue, tax revenue, off of the least amount of property that we've got.
Thank you, Mayor. Well, that just about wraps it up for the panel today. We've touched on a couple of dozen very meaty issues that I've got notes on that all could deserve an independent panel discussion. We want to thank our panel, Mayor Mark Stodel of the City of Little Rock, Mayor Mike Watson, the City of Maumelle, Gabe Holstrom, Director of the Downtown Little Rock Partnership, Ward Davis of High Street Development in Springdale, and Jimmy Moses of Moses Tucker Real Estate. Thank you all very much. And thank you all for watching. Again, once again, if you want to see Mr. Minicozzi's presentation, go to metroplan.org or to the link that is going to be on your screen. Thank you very much for joining us.